Okay, well, thanks very much. Well, yeah, the paper I'm giving today, you can see the title here, The State, Power Resources and Decent Work in Local Governments in Britain, Social Clauses and the Importance of Social Regulation within Public Procurement. So this is joint work with myself, my colleagues at Manchester, Matthew Johnson and Aristeia Kukiadaki from the School of Law. We're all members of the Work and Equalities Institute. Broadly speaking, the research is looking at public sector procurement, which in Britain was a very kind of enthusiastic early adopter, if you like, of outsourcing, fragmenting the public sector, privatization and so on under the kind of Thatcher regime, particularly from the 1980s onwards. And it's regulated in curious ways. There is a whole range of different forms of regulation which have kind of driven this restructuring. Things like compulsory competitive tendering and best value, for example, which place various requirements on public bodies to open things up for competition and to privatization and so forth. Outsourcing in the public sector is a key driver of low pay, precarious work, declining job quality and so forth. It's been a huge expansion of outsourced provision as a business sector. So if one could argue that the kind of crisis of accumulation seen in Britain in the 1980s with deindustrialization and so forth was partly responded to by the government of the day by opening up opportunities for private companies to increase their income through sources of taxation and so forth. So that's happened. It's made work worse, broadly speaking. There have in recent years been various policy initiatives, if you like, to partially mitigate the outcomes of this. These include things like employment charters. These are kind of various forms of codification where private sector outsourcing companies commit to meeting various employment standards, minimum standards of employment. You have Living Wage Foundation accreditation as well. There's the National Living Wage in the UK, which is essentially the minimum wage. And then the Living Wage Foundation is a kind of third sector organization which accredits employers that pay the so-called real living wage, which is around about 15% higher than the statutory minimum wage. Various other forms of soft regulations, such as the Social Value Act, which was introduced in 2013, also come into play here. So you've got in sorts of classic industrial relations terms, you've got various new forms of rulemaking, various established forms of industrial relations and collective bargaining being prominent within the local government sector, if you like, as well. So in terms of challenging this, in terms of influencing this from the perspective of workers and unions representing them, there are various kind of institutional and political power resources that unions hold at the level of local government, but that's underpinned by really highly variable levels of structural power and associational power. And one of the arguments of the paper, I suppose, is that these need to intersect ultimately if these various processes are genuinely going to be used to make working outsourced services better. There's far too much text on this slide, and I apologize for that. It's a character flaw of sorts. But I can go through this relatively briefly. I mean, there's been the restructuring of the 1980s, which I've mentioned. In the last 12 years, really, in particular, in Britain, we've seen sustained austerity and reductions in terms of, central government funding, in particular, for local government, for municipalities, and so on, which has placed great pressure on local authorities, and in some cases it's pushed them to privatize even further. There's also been a loss of associational power and institutional power in local governments as well, with union membership declining, union recognition becoming far more fragmented. Perhaps inevitably this has placed downward pressures on wages and working conditions, and while it varies quite a lot within local governments, significant areas of local government, such as adult social care, for example, are highly gendered. It's mostly women working within them as well. So there are various forms of segmentation reinforced by these processes, essentially. It's very difficult to organise and mobilise low-paid and precarious workers within these complex public sector supply chains. What we've seen, I suppose, are various responses to this, which I suppose, given we're at CRIMT, we can call innovations of sorts. These include notions of socially responsible procurement, various moves towards insourcing, bringing outsourced services back in-house, remunicipalization, sometimes more of an increase in the use of things like labour clauses and other social clauses within publicly procured services. We're also seeing union strategies towards this changing new, what we might call repertoires of contention. And this is often, focused on so-called winnable issues. While most unions would probably have a preference of bringing outsourced services in-house and, expanding collective bargaining coverage and so forth, the difficulty in terms of doing that in the current context of a failed state that is Britain just makes this incredibly challenging. So you could argue they're focusing more on what you might call winnable issues. So the introduction of living wage clauses, for example, to somewhat increase the pay of outsourced workers. Voluntary charters, which I've mentioned already as well, have been a feature within that. So relatively limited, but we'd argue significant means of attempting to improve the employment conditions of outsourced workers in what's otherwise a highly fragmented and ultimately uncoordinated system of collective bargaining that you see in Britain. So I'll go through this relatively quickly. Prior to the pandemic, obviously public procurement from the private sector increased massively during the pandemic, but as you can see here, in 2019, in that year, the UK government spent 274 billion on goods and services from the private sector. Approximately a third of public spending in Britain is essentially going to the private sector to procure services, goods, and so on. The government plays a key role in what it calls promoting progressive services. We see this kind of highly neoliberal language of, in creating markets as opposed to pandering to producer interest, for example. We've seen something of a shift. The Labour Party, when it was in government between 1997 and 2010, went further than the Conservatives had before them in terms of expanding privatisation, outsourcing, and so forth. That has since changed somewhat, particularly from 2015, when the Labour Party went under, for a short time, relatively left-wing leadership under Jeremy Corbyn. But even more recently, they've been talking about a mass programme of insourcing, challenging outsourcing companies and failed forms of outsourcing and so on. So there has been a shift in the political debate in Britain and an acceptance that outsourcing has been negative in a great many areas. So it's argued, Adheri and some of his colleagues have argued that this increased focus on insourcing, remunicipalization, local spending in terms of outsourcing, and so when local government procures services and goods, that it spends that money locally rather than it being siphoned out by multinational companies, and the use of various employment-related regulations, soft regulations, admittedly, like the Greater Manchester Good Employment Charter, for example, the Unison Ethical Care Charter, various others, living wage accreditation, various developments in devolved administrations such as Scotland and Wales. This kind of increased emphasis on employment, insourcing, and so forth, Adheri has argued, I would suggest perhaps somewhat sanguinely, really, given the circumstances, that it represents a new social democratic politics of the labour market. Things like living wage accreditation, employment charters, and so forth, it's argued, are challenging that notion of a unitary neoliberal state within the UK. Power resources come into this, and a quite a useful way of looking at it. So you've got very highly variable levels of associational power and structural power in some groups. For example, waste and refuse workers have relatively strong structural power. If they stop collecting people's rubbish, then everybody notices it. Whereas in other areas, such as adult social care, relatively weak levels of union membership and so forth mean that they have less power at that sort of level, despite the fact that the unions representing them have quite strong links to the political parties overseeing the regimes in local governments in the particular areas where they work. So just very briefly, in terms of the project, this was running from 2019 to 21. It was kind of locally funded, essentially, through the Alliance Research Fund at Manchester Business School. We've interviewed 113 people. We did a 55 local authority survey in England, and then 6 case studies of particular local authorities with a particular emphasis on social care on the one hand and also waste and recycling services on the other, both services which are almost overwhelmingly outsourced. So 113 interviews in total, including procurement managers, heads of service, managers from the outsourcing providers themselves, union representatives, and others working in relevant sectors. So in terms of some of the, I'm just going to keep an eye on where I am in terms of time. Yeah, okay. So in terms of just some of our, I mean, these are fairly initial findings. We're working through the analysis of these and currently in the process of writing them up in sort of journal article form, hopefully. The relationship that unions had with outsourcing was complex. I mean, so generally public sector unions supported insourcing, opposed privatization, but in some cases, you had local union reps who actually opposed insourcing as they feared the instability it would cause, and in austerity affected local government. They felt there was a risk that it could actually make things worse because going back in-house, so to speak, might see their employment conditions, you know, eroded even further. There was a bit of a sense of taking responsibility for the situation from some of the Labour-affiliated unions that we spoke to. We've got this kind of, in the first quote here, this sort of slightly lurid martial language being used. We built the bridge, they rolled their privatization tanks over. This interview was carried out around about February earlier in this year. So I guess we've been watching the news quite a lot, and this is what you get in terms of the metaphors used. But it happened under Labour's watch on a minimal scale. Once you cross a border, you're invaded, and we allow the invasion of private sector money into public services. But there was a degree of responsibility taken for that, and an argument that since 2015, with the Labour Party moving to the left, it was argued by unions locally that the leftward move of the Labour Party allowed unions locally to put pressure on elected members within local councils, local authorities, to say that you should be in favour of insourcing because it's now national policy. So it gave them a degree more leverage. And in some local authorities, you've got a newer generation of more ultimately left-wing Labour leadership. This argument that, you know, during the Blair and Brown years, 1997 to 2010, prior to that, you know, we could have been a Tory council, and that now there was a more progressive, forward-thinking commitment to insourcing. So there's something of a political shift, but in very difficult circumstances, affected by austerity in a way that made actually sort of buying services and bringing them back in-house essentially was still highly challenging. So you're seeing new forms of rules being introduced within local government's industrial relations, things like the Unison Ethical Care Charter, which is a sort of an agreement essentially that social care providers have signed up to in some cases, Living Wage Federation accreditation, which I've mentioned already, different approaches to procurement. So services would be procured, outsourcing companies would sign up to say, well, we won't use 0 hours contracts, we'll pay the real living wage. In some cases, we'll recognise unions or we'll adhere to pay rises agreed nationally through collective bargaining. But the oversight of this was relatively weak. So a home care commissioner in one of our cases explained, we haven't yet got to the point where we're checking whether or not they've done it. You know, so these would be agreed at the commissioning stage, but once it was actually there in practice, there was little from the employer side to make sure they were actually doing what they said they would do. Well, this next quote I think is quite interesting because this is from a former Conservative government, a former Conservative local authority that had since moved over to a Labour leadership. But you can see the political influences here. I mean, it's kind of Hayek at work at the level of the municipality in a way. They used to have a huge commissioning team. They had market relationship officers and contract management, but it was then reorganized by someone who had a view that the market would manage itself. And that's proved not to be the case, unfortunately. That's dry humor in the English case. So I mean, there was this belief that because it was marketized, that somehow that would regulate itself. And as we all know, that typically doesn't happen. So the monitoring and compliance of these contracts was often relatively weak, and there might be an emphasis on making sure people's bins have been collected, certainly, but not really any employer side oversight of whether they were actually adhering to the employment conditions they'd already agreed. In terms of what unions were able to do, associational power was hugely important in terms of actually making sure outsourcing companies adhered to what they'd agreed. given the employer side wasn't going to do it, much of the emphasis then fell on unions, who were stretched, they were fragmented, but they were really the last line of defense in terms of enforcing these employment clauses in outsourced work. So I have this union interviewee here. I mean, it confesses that a good number of their members don't necessarily have the knowledge of what's right and what's wrong in the workplace in terms of dignity at work, in terms of what was in the collective agreement. There was a real lack of information, really, or a lack of knowledge of what had actually been agreed. Things like the Ethical Care Charter, which is there to protect employment conditions and the quality of care given in the adult social care sector, that was signed up to by many care providers, and they would all probably give themselves a bit of a pat on the back, if you like, for having signed up to these sorts of agreements. But they would only really know if the terms had been breached when people complained, because the union was relatively weak in that sector and so forth. And often, they would argue that for that to have any real impact, I think you've got to be working towards a recognition agreement in social care, which wasn't the case within most providers. So just a few points just to finish up. I'm mindful of the time. There has been a discursive move in terms of insourcing social value, the inclusion of employment-related clauses in publicly procured services, which is a significant shift away from this cost-based model of outsourcing, which has been so dominant in Britain and elsewhere since the 1980s. This has partly been driven, certainly in terms of the Labour Party, the sort of political wing of the union movement. They've demonstrated a move away from this emphasis on low-cost outsourcing since 2015, and this is, potentially significant. We don't know whether the current government in Britain is going to last, 2 days or another 2 years. But I mean, if Labour do indeed take over after that, then we may actually see some movement on here. Although they're going to be dealing with fairly difficult circumstances, I think it's fairly evident. There are various pressures, including austerity, the incredibly long length of contracts. Contracts are often signed for 25-year periods precisely to escape any kind of political instability. So it's incredibly difficult to simply insource things, and uprating working conditions with such constrained budgets is very, very difficult. Real problems in terms of enforcement, and if enforcement of these clauses is going to happen at all, it's probably important for unions and their members to understand, but ultimately to value these sorts of clauses as well. The power resources approach is quite useful here. I mean, there's a great paper by Sean O'Brady in the British Journal of Industrial Relations quite recently, where he was demonstrating how associational power, for it to be meaningful, needs to be complemented by institutional power. But I suppose what we're seeing here is that the kind of political and institutional power resources that some unions had by virtue of their link to the Labour Party and the influence they had within local government, but for that to be meaningful, it really needed to be underpinned by associational and structural power as well. What we are seeing, I'll just finish on this point. I always try and not end presentations by saying everything's screwed, but I suppose what we're seeing is that you've got this wider fragmentation of local government industrial relations, but you've also got very high levels of inflation, labour shortages, which we're seeing in many other countries as well. But we're also seeing increasing levels of industrial action in Britain, quite widespread levels of strike action in waste and recycling services, in particular in Britain, where in many cases, without even going on strike, waste workers have been balloting. They've achieved 10, 11% pay rises in line and above inflation, because of the structural and associational power that they have. We've been seeing this in Manchester, also a high level dispute in Coventry and elsewhere as well. So I suppose we've got a highly fragmented situation which has been in place since the 1980s. It's riven with problems. But if anything, I suppose when we are seeing an upsurge of associational power, unions taking action in particular areas in the public sector, which may ultimately have spillover effects, and the possibility at long last of some political change as well, actually shifting the dial slightly on processes of outsourcing and the treatment of workers within them. So I'll finish on that. There's references there, but yeah, I'll leave it there and I'd welcome any questions. Thank you.